out was enough to satisfy his needs. Marco realized that small valuable objects kept disappearing, and that Adrian was selling them and using the money to feed his expensive habit. He tried to tell Alan tactfully, but he was not really interested. Alan was so wrapped up in his passion for Adrian that he would probably have forgiven him anything, or even deny that it could have been him. So Marco decided to catch him red-handed, in the act of performing one of his countless little thefts. He succeeded in doing so, but provoked a violent brawl, with kicking, punching and swearing. Alan had been sleeping at the time, but was woken up by the din and ran in to see what was happening. Marco explained the facts, but Alan, with little regard for impartiality, simply replied, "Two's company, three's crowd." Marco understood what those words meant, and so he decided to leave. Alan gave him enough money to be able to live in Paris for 1 week and dismissed him. Marco had been so honest during all those years that he had not saved up a penny. He realized that he would have to find himself a job, and quickly. He had always thought that he might like to be a journalist. So, he applied for a job at La Figar newspaper. They hired him, but only as an Italian/French translator. However, he showed greater potential, and after a year he became a reporter. The months continued to pass by. Marco was more and more impressive in his new role of reporter. Everyone was astounded by his brilliant intuition, but he worked with such modesty that he never provoked rivalry or jealousy. One morning, however, when he was reading the Paris news section of La Figar itself, he read that an elderly homosexual had committed suicide, because his young heroin-addict lover had contracted the terrible illness that showed no mercy. Marco wept, feeling a deep and genuine sadness, because despite everything that had happened, he still felt very fond of Alan. From this tragic personal experience, a determination grew within him to try and discover what had caused this plague to be unleashed on the earth. So, with the permission of his editor, who gave him carte blanche, he began his investigations into the matter. His inquiries brought him into contact with people from completely different worlds. From drug users to interviews with doctors, biologists and homosexuals. He entered all the data he gathered into his computer. And it soon became clear that there was a statistic anomaly that no one seemed to have noticed. None of the heroin addicts from the 70s who had stopped using the drug before 1980 had contracted the disease, even if they had been addicted for many years. On the other hand, those who had continued beyond 1980 had fallen ill, as had those who began using heroin after 1980. Quote, "There is not normally any difference in the natural capacity of any two individual human beings to combat illness. So why did drug users of the 70s not become ill, while later addicts contracted the disease even after having used the drug for only a short while? What was the factor that determined this difference?" Among the many biologists Marco interviewed, there was one who told him that laboratory experiments had been conducted into some unidentified viruses, created with restructured DNA. Their terrible potential remained dormant until they came into contact with blood. As liquid, it helped them to unleash their destructive power. As soon as Marco learned of this scientific research, he was struck by a flash of intuition. Deliberated contaminated heroin. There could be no other way. It was the only clear and logical explanation of the problem. Marco came to the conclusion that the motive behind this contamination had been the total eradication of drug addicts from the face of the earth. They were seen by authorities as an army of mercenary zombies. So potential source of spies who in the pay of hostile countries would have been able to undermine the national security of the so-called civilized nations. The governments of these nations had brought about this state of affairs. They had financed scientific research leading to the development of the dormant virus. This was then used to contaminate various large consignments of confiscated heroin, which were then put back on the streets. through the conventional channels of organized crime. The contamination had taken place on various occasions, and was still happening perhaps. Marco also figured that, in this way, these civilized governments would have managed to defeat the drug pushers as well. With the loss of their regular clients, they would have lost their huge financial gains, through which they were able to corrupt and kill. With the weakening of their power base, that is, their access to huge amount of money, they could be easily dealt with. Marco brought his conclusions to the attention of his editor, who, however, raised a question. How come this plague has also struck certain tribes in Central Africa? They have never had anything to do with heroin, Marco explained. Whoever had contaminated the heroin, before doing so, would have wanted to verify its effectiveness on humans. So, with the pretext of vaccinating these people against smallpox, they actually infected them with the new virus, which soon began to develop. These tribespeople were nothing more than unwitting and unfortunate guinea pigs. The editor raised another question. He wanted to know the dynamics of the virus transformation from its dormant to its active state. Now Marco replied with an example. Have you ever seen that medicine in capsule form? Well, the capsule is not the actual drug. The drug itself is the powder put inside the capsule, because it tastes too bitter to be taken on its own. When you swallow these pills, the outer casing of the capsule dissolves on contact with water and releases the drug itself. You may be wondering why I've given you this example. Well, heroin is not easy to contaminate. So they had to invent not only the virus but also the means by which to carry it. They had to ensure that it would not die despite being in an alien habitat. At the wrong temperature and without sustenance. The time from the contamination in the laboratory to the absorption by the drug user might be quite long. Days, weeks, maybe even months. However, microbiology allowed them to create a capsule exactly like the one containing the medicine I was talking about before. Only this one is 100 smaller than a pinhead. You probably still don't know why I'm telling you this. You see, the capsule contains the ideal conditions in which the virus can survive for as long as necessary, a bit like a chick in an egg. These egg-like capsules are as big as the grain of heroin with which they were mixed. So, when the drug addict injects the heroin, his blood acts like the water when you take an ordinary pill, and dissolves the capsule containing the virus, finally releasing it into its ideal habitat, the human body. Marco was making serious accusations. This was a scenario of clandestine and specifically target genocide. Having heard these explanations, the editor agreed to let Marco write an article on his theory. But through basic common sense it ended up as a short piece on the 5th page, written in the conditional tense to give the idea of an hypothesis rather than a verified news item. That would probably have been the end of the matter if one of the most important French television networks had not invited Marco on their highly popular Saturday night talk show to discuss the results of his investigations. The program went on air and Marco, in front of millions of viewers, revealed his theories, accusing former governments of genocide and present-day governments of hypocrisy and conspiring to hide the truth from the public. Marco immediately felt the consequences. He began to receive numerous anonymous telephone calls warning him to stop his research. In the street he was often almost run down by a car. Too often to be by pure chance.